Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history drifts softly into the quiet of night. What if I told you that the British Empire, the most powerful force of its age, was never truly in control of the lands it claimed? And what if losing just one of those colonies forced Britain to rethink its empire, reshaping the world in ways that still echo today? Of Boston to the fields of Nairobi, from Ireland's green hills to Delhi's crowded bazaars, rebellions and uprisings rose like sparks against the empire's grip. They chipped away at the illusion of unstoppable power, showing that even the mightiest force can be resisted. This is the story of how ordinary people stood against an empire, how resistance again and again forced Britain to change, and how in the end, independence became inevitable. Where that first great struggle erupted, across the Atlantic, in the American colonies. If you enjoy journeys like this, remember to like and subscribe. It helps bring more forgotten stories to light and ensures you'll never miss the next time we drift into history together. Imagine standing on a quiet street in Boston in the mid-17th century. For years, families here lived under the British Crown, but with remarkable independence. Local assemblies debated community issues, merchants grew wealthy through trade, and farmers trusted their distant rulers to mostly leave them alone. That balance shifted when Britain, burdened by the cost of wars in Europe, turned to its colonies as a source of revenue. What looked in London like a reasonable adjustment sparked anger few in Whitehall foresaw, a protest that cracked the foundations of empire. The first flashpoint came with taxation. In 1765, Parliament imposed the Stamp Act, requiring stamps on everything from legal papers to newspapers and even playing cards. In Britain, it seemed modest. In the colonies, it felt like an intrusion. A Boston printer, forced to buy stamps for every sheet he sold, suddenly felt London's reach in his daily life. Colonists believed taxation belonged to their assemblies, not imposed from abroad. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," grew from everyday frustration. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but paired it with the Declaratory Act, asserting its full authority. New duties under the Townshend Act soon followed, spreading boycotts and protests. For many, this was no longer about taxes. It was about authority itself. Boston became the flashpoint. Soldiers patrolled the city, clashing with residents. In 1770, tension boiled over when troops opened fire during a standoff, killing 5 colonists. The Boston Massacre shocked residents no longer saw their quarrel limited to duties on glass or paper. Blood had been spilled, and memories of it lingered. Then came the Tea Act of 1773. Parliament meant to save the East India Company by selling cheap tea in the colonies. But colonists saw it as a trap. Accepting the tea meant conceding Parliament's right to tax. That winter, men disguised as Mohawks boarded ships and heaved crates into Boston Harbor. The water darkened with leaves. The air filled with the scent of tea, while crowds on shore cheered. To them, this was no crime. It was a declaration of identity. Britain's authority had no place here. Punishment from London was swift. The port of Boston closed. Troops tightened their grip, and local governance was restricted. But instead of breaking resistance, these coercive acts united the colonies. Farmers in Virginia, merchants in New York, and artisans in Philadelphia began to see themselves as part of a common cause. The First Continental Congress soon gathered, giving the colonies a louder voice than Parliament expected. For the first time, the idea of being American rather than British subjects overseas began to take hold. By 1775, armed conflict erupted at Lexington and Concord. A year later, the Declaration of Independence announced a path no one had truly imagined a decade earlier. At first, the cause looked fragile, facing a British military vast in numbers and resources. But in 1777, the colonial victory at Saratoga convinced France to ally with the rebels, turning a colonial uprising into a global war. French fleets now threatened Britain's naval dominance, while American forces grew in confidence. The end came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. Trapped by French ships at sea and American troops on land, General Cornwallis surrendered. Britain lost not just a set of colonies, it lost its vision of being unchallengeable. 13 colonies had broken away, and independence was recognized. Force alone had failed to secure the empire, leaving Britain with a sobering reality. Its power, though vast, was not absolute. The American Revolution revealed that empires could crumble from within, toppled not by rival powers, but by determined resistance. Britain now stood at a crossroads. The struggle had peeled away part of its Atlantic world, and the question became how, or where, the empire could endure. That search for direction would define what came next. Picture Britain in 1783. News of defeat in America lingered in newspapers, in Parliament, and in the minds of merchants who had thrived on Atlantic trade. Some wondered if the nation's greatest days had already passed. Yet the empire didn't fold, it shifted. Attention turned eastward and southward, toward India, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Instead of retreat, there was redirection, with new opportunities waiting overseas. One sign was the growing power of the East India Company, whose revenues in Bengal and expanding trade in opium and textiles laid the groundwork for recovery. The American loss forced hard questions. Why had those colonies turned away? Many concluded that pressing direct control on settler societies had been a mistake. The empire could not dictate every law in distant communities. Britain leaned more heavily on commercial strength, tariffs, monopolies, and charters that generated wealth without sparking the same fury. The company's profit-driven model in Bengal stood as proof of what could be achieved. Immense influence gained through trade instead of micromanaging colonial assemblies. Nowhere did this logic matter more than in India. Even before the revolution, the subcontinent was central to British interests. But after 1783, its role grew dramatically. Bengal's cotton, indigo, and opium fueled British industry and filled treasury coffers. By focusing on India, policymakers replaced Atlantic losses with richer markets. Meanwhile, the Caribbean supplied huge profits through sugar plantations, powered by enslaved labor. Each ship unloading sugar in London reminded observers that the empire was not in decline, but shifting its balance. This global pivot demanded protection. The Royal Navy became the glue binding everything together. It safeguarded routes from the Caribbean to India, kept French or Spanish rivals at bay, and gave Britain unmatched flexibility overseas. Port cities like Liverpool and Bristol thrived under this system, their harbours crowded with ships heavy with sugar, cotton, and spices. To those on the docks, it looked less like an empire in retreat than one that had rotated its compass. Debate at home mirrored this change. Writers argued Britain had erred in America by failing to respect local identities. Better, they said, to grant settlers or elites partial autonomy while binding them into trade networks. This minimized unrest while keeping the flow of goods and capital intact. Instead of relying on governors and rigid laws, Britain leaned on merchants, markets, and monopolies to tether colonies to imperial structures. Economic patterns confirmed the shift. Revenue came less from direct taxation and more from control of markets. Sugar, rum, textiles, spices, and later woolen grain formed the new pillars of wealth. Britain learned that commercial dependence could be as powerful as political subordination. The empire was repositioned, less about legislating for colonists, more about managing global exchange. People also became tools of reconstruction. Loyalist families displaced from the new United States were resettled in Canada, where land and protection secured their loyalty. At the same time, convict transportation to Australia expanded, turning exile into colonization. Migration, whether voluntary or forced, planted enduring footholds of British culture across the globe. The loss of America had not destroyed Britain's empire, it reshaped it. India became the economic center, Caribbean sugar kept wealth flowing, and settler movements underlined Britain's reach. What had seemed like a devastating defeat instead became the foundation for rebuilding. And across the border from the new republic, one colony stood as both refuge and reassurance: Canada. When the American colonies declared independence, not everyone joined the new republic. Tens of thousands of loyalists, men and women unwilling to sever ties with Britain, paid dearly for their choice. Some were merchants, tied to trade with London. Others were landowners, reliant on imperial protection. And many simply believed stability rested with the crown. After 1783, large numbers fled by Royal Navy ships or marched north into British territory. Families branded as traitors often left everything behind. Imagine a household hastily gathering possessions, family Bibles, silver spoons wrapped in linen, before slipping away under harassment and violence. Displacement did not erase them, it reshaped Canada. Streams of loyalists arrived across the Great Lakes frontier, scarred but determined to rebuild. The Crown saw both risk and opportunity. Rather than let them scatter, Britain issued generous land grants, hundreds of acres at a time, to anchor new communities. These families, displaced but not defeated, were told they were not exiles, but the foundation of a renewed British presence. Where Americans celebrated independence, the North grew into a rival story of loyalty. Fort Niagara became one of the clearest symbols in this landscape. Guarding the Niagara River, it stood as both a bulwark and a statement that Britain had not vanished from North America. Many loyalists reached it after exhausting journeys through snow and across icy rivers. Accounts recall one winter when refugee families arrived hungry and cold, building makeshift shelters against the stone walls. For them, the flag above the ramparts meant safety, however harsh the conditions. On the far shore, Americans experimented with Republican rule. On the Canadian side, redcoats and settlers signaled Britain's ongoing grip. Migration soon became a tool of empire. In the 19th century, thousands of impoverished children from Britain were sent across the Atlantic. Between the late 1800s and mid-1900s, more than 100,000 British home children arrived in Canada. Labelled as charity, the program was meant to rescue them from poverty. In reality, many endured isolation, hard labour, and fractured families. The scheme bound future generations to Britain, but revealed how imperial promises often masked exploitation. Settlement in Canada was built as much on displacement and forced belonging as on voluntary migration. By the early 1800s, Canada was called a white empire outpost. Yet that phrase oversimplifies. The colony included British settlers, reproducing English laws, schools and churches, but also French-speaking communities, determined to preserve language and faith, and indigenous nations profoundly affected, often harmed by expansion. Towns grew with Anglican spires and streets named for British figures, while in Quebec, Catholic traditions and the French language endured. Canada was meant to mirror Britain, but beneath the surface were competing voices and contested ground. Still, Britain held it up as a model. Unlike India, where millions resented foreign rule, or the Caribbean, where enslaved labor sustained plantations, Canada projected stability. Here, Britain believed it had avoided the mistakes of America. Settlers were given land and autonomy. Cultures were partially acknowledged, and rebellion never grew into outright separation. Across the border, Americans pursued independence. In Canada, officials pointed to cooperation. Every farm cleared by a loyalist, every classroom reciting British history, reinforced the belief that empire could be replicated safely overseas. That stability, however, came at a cost. Indigenous peoples were forced from their lands. French Canadians often found themselves marginalized, and even loyalists carried scars of exile. Canada became Britain's showcase of order, but it was never evenly shared. By the 19th century, Britain could claim a northern foothold that demonstrated resilience after American loss. Loyalist communities, settler migration, and imperial institutions created an enduring extension of Britain overseas. In Parliament and newspapers, Canada's story reassured the public that the empire was not in decline, but simply rebuilt around new centres. Yet beneath the appearance of continuity lay a deeper question. If loyalty could be secured in Canada, what would happen in colonies that were neither settler strongholds, nor inclined toward Britain's cultural framework? That question loomed largest in the empire's most valuable possession, India, a land of wealth and scale unlike any other. Here, Britain's claims of authority would face their greatest test. If losing America had cast doubt on Britain's power, India presented a far greater challenge. With tens of millions of people, immense diversity, and fertile land producing cotton, indigo, and spices, India offered riches far beyond what Britain had lost in the Atlantic. Yet ruling such a vast territory through armies and tax systems meant constant risk. India was the empire's prize, but also the seedbed of its greatest resistance. Britain's foothold was not carved first by the crown, but by a corporation. The East India Company, trading in Indian ports since the early 1600s, shifted in the 18th century from commerce to conquest. The decisive moment came in 1757, at the Battle of Plassey. Company forces defeated the Nawab of Bengal and gained the right to collect taxes in one of the wealthiest provinces in the world. From then on, the company acted less like a business and more like a state, fielding private armies, running courts, and enforcing revenue demands across lands the size of European kingdoms. Imagine a corporation today, wielding armies and levying taxes over millions. That was the company's reach. In Bengal, land taxes became relentless, where villages once endured poor harvests with local safety nets. Company demands left no room for relief. During famine in the 1770s, millions starved, while officials still collected revenue and exported grain. Systems that had once helped communities endure collapse gave way to resentment. For Britain, India was promoted as progress. For farmers and townspeople, it meant deprivation under foreign rule. Discontent deepened over decades, until it finally erupted. In 1857, sepoys, Indian soldiers who formed the backbone of the company's army, sparked open rebellion. Rumors spread that new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim faiths. Refusing the cartridges meant punishment. Using them meant betrayal of belief. Behind this flashpoint lay years of slights, low pay, and cultural arrogance. The cartridges only lit the fire. The revolt swept across northern India. In Delhi, insurgents rallied under the symbolic authority of Bahadur Shah II, the aging Mughal emperor. His practical power was slight, but his name gave the uprising a link to the pre-British order. Fighting was fierce. At one point, defenders set off the city's gunpowder magazine, an explosion that tore through soldiers and civilians alike, both a desperate act and a symbol of India's devastation. Battles followed at Kanpur, Lucknow, and other strongholds, but Delhi's fall marked the turning point. British forces retook the city with overwhelming firepower, leaving entire neighborhoods in ruins. Streets rang with cannon fire, reprisals, and executions. Beyond the fighting, famine and displacement spread suffering across the countryside. Estimates of the death toll vary, but many historians place Indian casualties with as many as 800,000, most of them civilians. The revolt ended company rule. In 1858, Parliament dissolved the company and placed India under direct crown authority. The Raj was proclaimed, promising reforms, fairness, and modernization. Railways, telegraphs, and new codes of law soon followed. But none of this erased memories of famine, massacre, and humiliation. The scars of 1857 endured. India's rebellion exposed the fragility of imperial power. Britain could hold land by force, but loyalty was another matter. The people of India had shown they would resist when pushed too far. And in the years ahead, whenever hunger or neglect returned, those fractures would surface again. Reminders that empire, however vast, always stood on unsteady ground. How could an empire that claimed order and progress preside over mass starvation? In 1943, Bengal, despite fertile fields, was consumed by famine. As Britain projected efficiency, families searched for scraps of rice, mothers carried skeletal children, and villages emptied under hunger. The disaster exposed the gulf between imperial rhetoric and lived reality. Pulled into World War II without choice, India's fields and factories served Britain's war machine. Grain was diverted abroad while soldiers marched to distant fronts. A cyclone in 1942 destroyed crops and transport. Speculation sent prices soaring and relief lagged. Millions died. Reports of the famine were downplayed, but the truth filled Calcutta's streets. Children reduced to bone, families abandoned infants at camp gates. Villages collapsed roadside, while grain trains left Bengal. Hunger revealed the empire's failure more clearly than any speech. For survivors, each day was a gamble. Relief came too little, too late. The famine scarred households, villages, and generations. Politically, it was devastating. Nationalist leaders seized it as proof that Britain could not rule. By 1947, independence was no longer debated, but inevitable. The Bengal famine marked the Raj's moral breaking point. Empire could censor words, but not hide hunger. Millions dead by neglect stripped Britain of legitimacy, not just in India, but across its colonies. In the early 1950s, fertile Kenyan lands known as the White Highlands were kept almost entirely for European settlers. Kikuyu farmers, pushed into crowded reserves, lost not only soil, but dignity. Out of this injustice, the Mau Mau movement was born. At night, in secret gatherings lit by firelight, Men and women swore oaths to defend their land and protect one another. These vows bound communities with a unity stronger than any weapon. The colonial state responded with force. A state of emergency brought mass detentions, forced villages, and torture inside the infamous pipeline camps. Families were uprooted overnight, and entire communities lived under barbed wire and suspicion. Yet in the forests of Mount Kenya and the Aberdares, fighters carried on. With hunting rifles, homemade weapons, and determination, they staged ambushes that reminded settlers their power was not absolute. The struggle was brutal. Thousands died in camps, reprisals, or in battle. By the late 1950s, Mau Mau was suppressed, but its memory endured. In stories, songs, and testimony, decades later, survivors forced Britain to admit its crimes and issue a historic apology. When Kenya won independence in 1963, official accounts minimized Mau Mau's role, but for ordinary people, it became a symbol of sacrifice and resistance. Their story showed a deeper truth. Across Britain's empire, power was always contested, and in Kenya, hunger for land and freedom proved stronger than fear. The story of the British Empire is not one of smooth conquest, but of constant struggle. Every land it touched pushed back, reshaping how the empire functioned. From the American Revolution to the Indian Rebellion, from famine in Bengal to the Mau Mau in Kenya, the pattern is clear. Imperial rule endured not through absolute control, but through constant adaptation under pressure. History reminds us that even the mightiest powers cannot govern forever without consent. What weakened Britain's empire was not one single defeat, but a long chain of resistance, setbacks, and voices that refused to be silenced. These nations and movements were not passive subjects. They were active authors of their own futures and of the modern world we inherit today. If you've enjoyed this quiet journey through history, I invite you to share your own family or national stories of resistance in the comments. And if you'd like more calm, reflective storytelling, please remember to like and subscribe so you'll never miss the next time we drift into the past together.